Today's guest on the Winning Teams podcast is Kim Bohr, who is the founder and CEO of the Innovare Group. Kim is an expert at diagnosing and repairing disconnects in organizations. So who should be listening to this? Well, anybody who's in a leadership role, a CEO, business owner, anybody who is leading a senior team really needs to understand what Kim is talking about here in terms of disconnects, because disconnects in organizations hurt us and cost us very deeply. She also talks about poor execution and how that really, you may have a great strategy, but if you've got poor execution, it's not worth the paper that it's written on. So anybody who's in that leadership role really needs to understand it. And Kim talked about how you go about repairing those disconnects and also how you prepare your future leaders to have the right mindset and also to create and build the skills that they need in order to manage in this new environment. She talks amusingly about what she refers to as her leadership Bermuda Triangle, and I won't spoil it by telling you what that is, but it's really, really interesting, and I think there's so much truth in what she's talking about there. So lots of tips, lots of tactics, a lot of strategies that Kim talks about and shares with us, and she's got deep experience with many, many major organizations and really well worth listening to. If you want further leadership information and tips and strategies, then go to my site, www.johnmurphyinternational.com. And there you'll be able to download the book, which is based on the work I've done with Fortune 500 leaders. But in the meantime, sit back and enjoy the conversation with Kim. You will be glad that you did it. Kim, you're very welcome here today. Thanks for joining us on the Winning Teams podcast.
Thank you, John, for having me. I'm excited to be here.
No, it's great. Hey, it's all the way from Seattle, so it's a nice part of the world that you come from. One of the things that you are is an expert at diagnosing disconnects and devising actionable solutions. Can you explain what you mean by disconnects and what are the disconnects that you come across?
Definitely. So often when we're brought in, it has to do with something not, just not seeming to be moving as well as it should be. So it could be that from an organizational standpoint, there's really starting to have friction between leaders inside the organization. It could be that it's goals are being missed, and so it's a matter of what's going on. We had this plan, everything seemed to be solid, and now we're really off of it. And so what's going on? So it's those disconnects that become little hints that then prompt me to start asking a lot of questions to figure out what's really going on.
And what are the kind of typical disconnects that you actually find? What are the ones that you go into an organization and you kind of think, I reckon these are going to be the 4 or 5?
Yeah. So, the tagline we like to say that is really this anchor point is solid strategy won't survive poor execution. And so the disconnects start to happen in that execution side. And it's typically in two different categories. So one is people and one is process. And when we talk about process, we're not talking about over engineering how everything should be functioning. It's really some of those foundational processes around communication, how we're messaging, where we've been, where we're going, how frequently, how we're managing meetings. So it's that level of process. And then from a people side, it's often where, leaders are not being aligned. There's acting inside of silos, and people are just really focused on their own part of the business and not looking across the board. It's looking at a lot of dysfunction between sales and marketing breaking down. And what we often find too is that months and months have been built into strategy planning, and then all of a sudden it's a push out the plan and tell everybody to go. But what breaks down is there's a lack of operational planning. There's a lack of bringing leaders together to say, okay, how do we do this collectively. And so we'll find that it's in that theme of execution, people, and process that we tend to see where the biggest disconnects happen and then cause the biggest heartache as well.
And how do you work with the team then to, I mean, okay, so you can go in and you can point it out, but
Hmm.
that's, I was going to say that's the easy bit. I'm not saying it is necessarily easy, but
Understood. Yeah.
yeah, but in the sense of that, okay, so fine. So now we know. How do you actually fix the problem?
So a lot of it's around, let's understand the really at the root of what the cause is. So is it that we've got behaviors that are just not getting the results that individuals need to have inside this organization? Is it that people are feeling like they're cogs in the wheel and they're not actually understanding why what they're supposed to be doing is tied to the bigger plan of the organization? So there's really that disconnect of ownership and role. Or is it that, everybody is operating very independently? So when we start to understand what's going on, then we start to bring everybody together. So it could be, skill building at an individual leader level or at a team level, and really understanding what are the behaviors that they're each exhibiting, and where's that conflict coming. And if we use some tools that are very data driven. And so from that data driven standpoint, we could really drive the conversation in a way that doesn't feel like judgment and blame, but it's really around, let's look at the data and how the data is informing what's happening in the team and ultimately what the results are that are being had. We'll also look at then, what is it from? Is it just then a training issue that has to happen, a skill building issue, or is it really a bigger, strategy issue around, okay, everybody's acting in silos. We've got to break the silos down and start creating interaction and process between everybody where they realize they need to be more aligned to be stronger. And so some of it becomes a little bit more hands-on strategy work of getting them all into putting some of the process in place that isn't there, giving them, more refined opportunities of how they meet, how that should run, down to maybe it is more individual and team behaviors, and we need to really get that piece, solid before we can do anything bigger.
Yeah, it's interesting because in my experience of working with teams, there are a couple of kind of regular chestnuts that kind of crop up.
Mm-hmm.
But one of the things that I do find quite often is that when you're looking at the work, okay, you're looking at the design of the team in terms of, have we got the right people in the right roles doing the right work in the right way? And very often you find that, well, perhaps we don't have the right people, or
Right.
perhaps we have the right people but in the wrong roles. And is actually figuring that out. And very often I found that the work ends up being a kind of a catalyst for change in that
Mm-hmm.
space. And I don't know if that's something that you've come across extensively in the work that you have done, where a team has ended up, there's been a group of people that have ended up together, but it's not necessarily the right mix of people.
Yeah, I think that's incredibly common. And we're seeing that, still people are being promoted based on performance as the number one driver, but that doesn't necessarily mean they actually have the traits that are needed to be really good at leading a dynamic team, or good at coming together with a team and bringing their specific skill set in. And so it ends up becoming, as we start to unpack it and look at that data, it does start to become more of a change initiative. And a lot of what I talk about is anytime, I really try to encourage leaders to think about anything they're implementing from a lens of a change initiative. So when we're trying to roll out a new plan and we say, okay, here's our portion of it, we've got to go. If we don't take people along in that journey of where we've been, where we are, and where we're going, then they really start to disconnect early. They don't understand. They feel like, okay, why does this matter? And so it's really an important piece that, to your point, I find very much the same thing, where we've got to have a mindset shift in order for this to really to move them forward to a place that's really healthy and productive as well.
Yeah. The other thing that I find, and I know that you talk about it, and you mentioned it already, is the alignment, the clarity and the alignment
Yeah.
on goals. I did some work with the team there some time ago, and during the course of the day, it was kind of clear that they were not quite all on the same page in terms of
Hmm.
priorities. And asked, as a team, what were the team's top three priorities? And they were scarily, all over the place. And it
Right.
wasn't intentional. I mean, there wasn't nobody was being kind of Machiavellian or difficult or anything like that.
Hmm.
But it's just simply a lack of clarity. And of course, in the absence of clarity, you decide your own direction. Is that something you come
Right.
across?
Very much so. Our culture in business is very much still a busy culture. It's about, let me just check the box off my list and move on to the next thing. And to your point, when we've got teams that are just told we've got to move this forward and somebody takes their piece and decides, okay, this is the piece I'm working on, it becomes this level of heads down work that then completely misses the bigger picture, misses the fact of collaboration. And to your point, it's not ill intended. It's just a byproduct of this busy culture we've created inside organizations today. And so it's about how do we, we can't do away with the busyness necessarily, but we do have to figure out how do we bring, lift people's heads up again and have them actually starting to pause and say, okay, wait a second, is what I'm doing connected to what you're doing? Are we really saying this is the most important thing because, it was last week, but I'm hearing things differently this week, and actually taking the time to ask those questions versus just saying whatever and just doing the work. And I think that's the rut a lot of companies and teams are really stuck in right now.
Yeah. I mean, you talk about that, all of the work you do is it's about a change initiative. And I would agree with that. But I think you probably find that most teams know that, they're not working terribly well. I mean, they kind of intuitively kind of know it. But one thing is knowing, and the second thing is doing something about it. So that's kind of both kind of an intellectual exercise, but also it's an emotional exercise because you've got to change. What do you find are those kind of catalysts for change, for saying, okay, it isn't working, but now I'm going to do something about it? What is it, do you find, is those moments where that pivots?
I think the moments that are most popular versus where we want to get people to are a little different. So I think what we tend to find is that, we've missed the goal significantly, whatever the goal is, whether that be a product rollout or, sales numbers. We've missed the goal significantly. We've just lost our top performer that we expected would always be here, or our top, expert inside our team. And we didn't see that coming. So I think those become those really dramatic wake up calls, as well. What I believe we need to get people to see though, is how do we not get to that suddenly place? How do we start to back up and look at more of these underlying indicators that start to emerge? And then how do we empower individuals on that team who maybe aren't leader by title to raise a hand and say, hey, I'm getting a sense we're going off course, and it could be, the frontline first, line engineer versus somebody who's leading that team. And I think that's what we need to do, is have those individuals who start to understand what are they looking for, and then give them the power to actually speak up and raise a hand when they feel like something's off.
Yeah.
What do you think on that from your perspective?
Yeah, I think that from my perspective, what I find is that you need to get the conversation going.
Yeah.
And for people to start talking about what the real issues are. Because there's always something that's kind of either we don't talk about it, we don't address it, we don't feel it's the right place to do it or the right environment. And I think you've got to create, this kind of psychological safety, that you create an environment that, listen, let's actually talk about it. Because I know, as you're looking at the book behind you, the successes, failures, and lessons learned, right?
Yes.
And I was smiling to myself when I saw that on your site, because I'm a great believer in that process, right? And I start most meetings with saying, let's look at our successes, let's look at our disappointments, and let's look at the lessons learned, right? Because, in organizations, we'll blame, well, it's the market, it's the environment, it's this, it's that, it's somebody outside. But actually, when you do that exercise, as per your book, you realize, something, the failures kind of happened because of how we did or didn't do things internally.
Right. Right. And what I find, the reason I chose that word specifically was because I want people to embrace it as a catalyst for growth. Yeah. Because we can't, we want to celebrate our strengths, but we also have to learn from both what we do well, so we know what to do more of, and then what we didn't do well. And the failures don't necessarily have to be catastrophic. I mean, they could just be, slight missteps that we say, you know what, that didn't land well. That really didn't foster, that relationship any stronger than, what I was trying to get out from it. So it's really more of this place of understanding as a catalyst for growth. How do you then embrace that and say, okay, I'm putting that into my lessons learned, and now I'm going to move forward. But to your point, we tend to still have stigma around failure being something that we should just not admit to and not want to be vulnerable about. And that really just keeps perpetuating this terrible pattern we're in with, where that conversation doesn't get started.
Yeah.
And it's not
And I
going to
also
move
think it's not
us
taking
forward.
ownership of the failure. I think it's still not taking ownership,
Completely.
not actually owning it. I mean,
Yeah.
I had a conversation with a team recently, and it was actually really interesting to listen to them talk about, because it was the first time they'd done this kind of exercise. And when it was okay, so they had the successes, they had their failures or disappointments, and we say, okay, well, why did that happen? I mean, the
Hmm.
successes don't happen on their own, but the failures don't either happen on their own, right?
Right.
So what was it about how you work or don't work together that created that failure? Because that's what it has done. And for them, it was actually about the fact of the matter is we don't make hard decisions quick enough, right?
Yes.
And that was a real light bulb, and it was them that said it. I mean,
Hmm.
they were kind of, when we look at it, this is actually so that's a real moment in
Right.
terms of if we can embrace that and get to that level of self-awareness, then we can actually move forward. And I think that's really what you're talking about in that.
Very much so. And I have had a similar experience where I had been surprised by the level of lack of accountability and anybody wanting to own anything inside an organization. And it was a really, really tough culture. And it was a culture that acquired a company I was working with. And to this day, it's a culture that is still struggling to really own being comfortable making a decision and not making it from a place of fear in a lot of ways. So there's still a lot of work there for that company.
Yeah, I mean, you said earlier on, and I think it's really interesting one that that a solid strategy does not survive a poor execution, which I would
Mhm.
absolutely agree with. I think the other thing is I kind of go back. I think it's Peter Drucker who said it. That culture eats strategy every day. And you do talk about culture because that's really important
Mhm.
in the work that you do and what you talk about, isn't it?
It really is because at the heart of culture are people understanding why their work matters, how it fits to the big picture. Do we have a culture that invites the conversations to be had when something feels off? Do we empower people to act as owners inside of an organization, regardless of what level they're at? And so you can spend as much time and feel that the strategy is solid, and if your culture is toxic, it's not going to land. It's not going to work. And so much of that alignment of people and process is part of it is very much around this culture of communication. How do you communicate? How do you allow people to come into the fold and feel a part of what's unfolding inside this company? And that's very much culture driven. And so
Mm.
yeah, I agree that I used to think that organizations really needed to focus harder on strategy. And where I started to shift after a lot of work was we could debate whether their strategy is real strategy or where it's really differentiated or where it's really strong. Really, though, in some ways that doesn't matter because if they don't have these other pieces in place, it's going to fail no matter
Yeah,
what.
it does.
So
Yeah, I
it's
know.
really like, let's get these pieces set first.
Yeah. I remember doing a piece of work. I was invited to do a piece of work, but they said to me before I went in, oh, by the way, we've spent a fortune with another consultant developing a strategy, right? So we're kind of bringing you in to do this bit, right? And I said, well, thanks a lot for starters, for you
Yeah,
even asked me to do the strategy
right.
piece. But in the first day, I kind of thought to myself, I'm not sure all these guys are on the same page. So
Hmm.
I got everybody after a coffee break. I gave them large post-its and I said, listen, just for my sake, would all of you just write the three key elements of the strategy on the post-its? And
I love it.
you could see everybody going, "Oh God!" Right? And they'd only done this about a month beforehand, right? But it was scary, and for the boss, it was terrifying because they had invested a lot of time and money to get this done, and clearly it hadn't landed. And I think they just
Right.
hadn't connected to the business and hadn't connected to the values and how they do things and how they actually work. And that gap was missing, and you've got to make those. And I think things like values, become the glue that kind of keeps the whole thing together, which is you're talking about culture.
Very much so. And I think the slippery slope with values is if they're posted on a wall, but then they're not actually ingrained inside the day in and day out. And I think we
Yeah.
both see probably a lot of that as well, and
That's the old box ticking exercise. Oh, we need
Yes.
values. Oh yeah, we've done that. Yeah, we did that last year. Thank you very much. We move.
Yep,
We
we
move
did it.
on.
They're still there. They're on one of those walls as we walk down to the
Exactly.
kitchen, I think.
In all of the work that you're doing, because you're talking about change, and you mentioned it that where you're talking about a leadership team, and some people have been put onto that leadership team because they're experts as opposed to being good managers or good leaders. But there's a big challenge in preparing the leaders in today's environment because the people we're hiring are different to what I was like when I was joining an
Right.
organization with a different mindset. So, how do you prepare the leaders to actually roll this out and actually build on from there?
Well, what I tried to really instill in organizations is that we need to develop the qualities of leaders much early on inside companies when before people are ever leading others and before they're even tapped for a high potential program, because I think even then we could still have the wrong profile of person potentially. And so I really start to say, what can you do as you're leading to start to bring awareness to others, to start to see potential in people, much earlier before they're, ready to even get into maybe even a supervisor role. And how do you start to look down inside your organization and start to then impart a lot of the type of work we're talking about, where it is about the qualities of leading and holding an owner type of a mindset, and
Mhm.
then allowing those people to really drive a lot of their career development. So part of what I believe is that we need to not only put career development on the part of an organization, but we really need to invest and encourage individuals to not wait to be tapped, to really decide what is it I need and what can I do for myself so that they can start moving themselves into that, into strengthening what I believe is a, more robust leadership pipeline. So when we look at it from a leader perspective, a lot of it is around, if we truly believe that our job is to find the best people for our organizations in order to, to be the most competitive, to provide the best value to our clients, then we really have to look at how we are building that pipeline of talent very differently, because we're shortchanging. We're not necessarily casting the widest net, and even inside our organizations around the men and women that should be included. And so I think a lot of it is that mindset shift of how do you start to think broader and how do you start to look more just very differently, not wait for your recruiter partner inside your organization to bring you somebody, but really start to figure out who's showing that they have potential. The other thing I think is really important is that we really need leaders to be thinking more with the head and the heart. I think so much of the work you and I do is really around how do we help people realize there's that needed connection between head and heart. And I think a lot of leaders still miss that, and when they're going into leadership. And so helping them find that early on is, I think, incredibly important to fostering stronger, businesses overall.
Yeah. I think it's a really good point that you're making, and I think that kind of people getting ready for roles, and because I find when I'm coaching, particularly people in large corporates, the one thing that I would always say, okay, as much as you can, you know, try and manage your own career as opposed to having it managed for you, right?
Right.
So be really
Right.
proactive. And I know you can't determine that you will get the next job, but it's always looking at kind of, well, what's the next type of role that I would ideally like to move towards, and then understanding what's the gap between both,
Yes.
my knowledge and my skills, and also how I need to think. Because
Hmm.
all of those things are important. It can be a skill thing, it can be a knowledge thing, it can be kind of a mindset and how you go about thinking. So I think it's actually getting people to prepare for that, because otherwise, and you would have found that you'd have come across many people who've ended up, but yeah, at a senior level in an organization, and kind of think, how did I end up here? And they hate it, right?
Right. Oh, completely.
But they've just let the organization move them through. So you can't blame the organization. You know,
Right.
you've got to take responsibility for it yourself, and I think that's really what you're saying there. One of the things I was interested in is because you do say it, and I think you've got an article that to talk about the 5 common mistakes that leaders make that hinder growth. I'm just wondering, what
Yes.
are those 5 common
So
mistakes?
So they're in that realm of, when we're in high growth times, we think that it's never going to stop. So we stop doing the things we need to do to keep investing and fostering into a healthy business from a people perspective. One of the others is from a networking perspective, from our own professional network of building that out. We get so busy, we don't think about, do we actually have the time to go look and expand our talent, or look for, where our clients might be that we're not, in some of these other areas. The other is really around when oftentimes when we're moving fast, we just want to put a person inside a seat. And that's really a big disconnect when we then start to perhaps, set our values aside, as we were saying, or maybe we just say, you know what, they don't have everything we need, but that's okay. We need to get the numbers in. So let's just get them in. And then we find, day 91, this person is not only not performing, but is not anything like what we thought we hired. And so it's the shortcuts that we get tempted to take when we're in these really high growth moments that we really need to be diligent of, and realize that that we need to keep the formality that we've established for a reason, and to stay true to these particular areas so we don't actually lose our sight of what we're trying to achieve, because everything is cyclical, and we're going to need the investment that we're making in the high growth times for when we're in a recovery time as well. And so those are really those key areas. And one area that, to your question earlier, that I think is incredibly important is, I've often hear people, and I'll be curious if you hear this as well, say things like, just tell me how to get there. Like, how did you do it? I just want to follow your footsteps. And one of the things that I've often told people, and I tell leaders this a lot, is, I tell actually when I'm doing talks with students in universities, when I volunteer time there, I'll remind them that, every generation, every person has had to open their own doors, and like the generation before me opened doors so that I didn't have to open the same doors. So we each have our own doors to open. And so in that, it's really important that leaders understand it's not about replicating. It's not about me being able to tell you exactly what to do. It's about you going and starting to figure out what is it I should be doing for myself, because my path and journey is going to be very different than those that came, before me.
Yeah, and I think there's a difference between modeling behavior and asking for, can you just give me the quick fix?
Yeah,
Can
just
you
tell
give
me
me?
what to do. It's completely different.
Yeah, it's completely different, and because environment changes, context changes, and all of those things that they impact upon and determine what you should be doing. And something that I did in a different context 10 years ago does not exist today, and is
Right.
not valid. It's not valid today. So I think it's usually one of the things that I was kind of slightly amused and curious about was you talked about the leadership Bermuda Triangle.
Yes.
What is
So
that?
so there's a few elements inside what we call that leadership Bermuda Triangle. And really what it's about are those behaviors that when all three of those are in play, there's two really big factors that happen. Work tends to die, which is where we've kind of coined it off that Bermuda Triangle. And, leading others and growth really suffers. So we find certain behaviors that cause this triangle to be things like leadership permissiveness. So really not having the ability to stay engaged in enforcing others with really what needs to be done to keep moving them forward and the business forward. We find that being too overly helpful in a way that really that doesn't help give structure to be part of that contributing factor. And we look at another factor around communication. And so for people who tend to be very either evasive in their communication or just lacks that ability to be very clear and concise, also contributes to that. So when a leader, as we were saying before, how we oftentimes get leaders inside roles because they've been technically sound, we don't always know that they're very well suited for the role. And so these are the type of behaviors we look at. And when we see this certain three out of alignment, we call it the Bermuda Triangle, because it's pretty certain that this person's going to be set up to fail, ultimately to fail that team. And so the sooner we can identify those behaviors, the quicker we can help that leader gain the skills they need, make sure it's really the right path for them to be on. Maybe they're there, but they really shouldn't be leading others, that sort of thing. So we affectionately coin it the Bermuda Triangle.
I love that because I think that the three that you've chosen, I think they're absolutely the right ones,
Mm-hmm.
and that does kind of touch on what you talk about, moving from friction to clarity in communication.
Yes.
And
Yeah. So
no, I was just saying I've never gone into an organization where they've said to me, we're brilliant at communication. It's never happened to me.
I agree. And, the focus of that particular topic is about friction is healthy. It helps bring new ideas. It helps us get clear in pieces that maybe we're not understanding one another by. What often happens, though, is there's a lot of models out there that talk about, well, here's how you have these particular conversations. And what I was finding was that there was a real gap into, well, what causes the friction in the first place? And if we actually could identify what causes the friction, then we understand what it is that we need to do to help gain the clarity. So, for example, one of the areas that I find to be a really dominating factor in friction is when somebody doesn't receive recognition for their work. And so that's different for everybody. But one of the classics is when, a boss goes and claims that he or she is the one who accomplished this project, when really it was somebody on their team that did the hard work and their name is never brought into the conversation as part of that. So that's a really big piece. Or when the person's in the room with the leader and they're realizing it feels like they're taking my idea, and it might be intentional, it may not be, but that's one of those pieces that cause friction, that it's really around not having this sense of recognition for the work done. Another one that's really common is around just simple miscommunication, how we communicate very differently. Some people are very clear and concise from the moment I use the concept of two triangles that are inverted. So some people are very clear and concise and direct the whole way. Others are what we maybe call the external processors, and what they say at the beginning and where they land can look very different as they work through those conversations, right? And that becomes miscommunication and conflict. That then is friction. So if we understand those sorts of things, then we know actually how to find the clarity we need, and versus just jumping into models that address conflict alone, but don't necessarily go back to the root cause.
I love that because I think that this communication or the lack of communication just creates so many difficulties and so many challenges. And very often, people fall into the trap and say, well, but I did communicate that, but they communicated it once, and
right.
And also not giving context for communication. Sometimes we give communication out of context. And so that actually leads people to have a very different interpretation than what we intend. And also not going back and checking is that what was communicated, what did you actually understand by it? So right. I think that what you're saying is absolutely true. Kim, this has been great. Can I just, a couple of things before we wrap up? The book that's behind you, and we touched on it, Successes, Failures, and Lessons Learned. I'm just curious that you published that book. Just what drove you to actually write a book with that title?
So it's a 12-week guided journal, and I did it because I was seeing over and over again in the work I was doing with the disconnects was that people were just moving way too fast inside their organizations, and they weren't actually stopping to look at what was the impact they were making. It was just check a box and move on. And what I started to look at was then this lack of impact was affecting confidence, but it was also affecting execution, and it was affecting the way we could have a strong culture inside our organizations. And so I really was looking for what's a tool out there that doesn't exist today that can help drive accountability and performance in a way that people really want to own, and it can build confidence. So for organizations, it becomes this missing link of allowing them to put into their hands of their employees, or for individuals to do it on their own. And they walk through 12 weeks of this guided professional development that allows them to record each week what are the successes, failures, lessons learned, but they're also really benching each week against what did I say I want to do, how well did I do it, with the idea of creating this accountability that comes out the other end. And so for me, it was a way that I was hoping to get into hands of people, whether they we're able to do it at an organizational level and an individual level, so that people would have something that they could feel they could wrap their hands around and feel more confident in. Because when we look at people trying, as we were talking about earlier, trying to strengthen this leadership pipeline, if we have people that don't believe they're making a very big impact, or their lessons learned are not as deep and rich as they could be, then we end up doing a disservice to them. And we do a disservice to our companies because we don't have the best talent in play.
I think it's brilliant. Love that idea. I think it's absolutely super. Listen, before we wrap up and you can tell us where people can get in touch with you, the two questions I ask everybody: a book that you have read that's had an impact upon you?
So to this day, it's still back to Marshall Goldsmith's "What Got You Here Won't Get You There."
All
I
right.
was a
Yeah.
very young leader at the time, and I was not leading well. And I tried to have insight from my managers. I asked for feedback, and they didn't have it. And I think they didn't have it because they very much in this conversation we're talking about didn't have the skills to lead. And so it became the catalyst for me to take on myself and to understand, because I didn't want to be a poor leader. And from that, I ended up working with one of his professional coaches at the time, and we, it kind of just transformed me. So to this day, I still realize the impact, but it's also so true in business how when we hit these different stages, whether we're talking about as a leader or we're talking about as a growth of a company, we have to reassess and do things differently. Our profiles don't look the same. Our plans don't look the same. And so I felt like it's one that still resonates very true for me.
I love that book. It's been a number of years since quite a number of years since I read it, but it's really powerful, and I think the message is as relevant today as ever, if not even more so.
Agreed.
Because I think it's such a changing environment. Yeah, I was doing an interview there earlier on today with somebody about the whole issue of diversity. Right now, if you're leading an organization that is actually really embedding diversity, that's a whole different skill set that you haven't just acquired that learning along the way. It's a whole different game. So I would agree with you. I think it's a great book. You just reminded me I probably should take it out and have a read of it again. The other question on that, because I'm always fascinated by individuals' daily rituals, and I find that it's interesting from talking to successful people and reading about successful people. They tend to all have them. They're different, but I'm just curious what yours are.
So mine, the two that I'm really consistent with is my meditation. So I wake up in the morning and I do, 10 to 20 minutes of meditation. Try to hit that 20-minute mark, but I'm always consistent with at least 10 minutes of grounding. And for me, I use transcendental meditation. It's what's most powerful for me. And then I have a gratitude journal. The journal I use is called the 5-minute journal. And it starts off with the morning of some very specific, components, gratitude, top 3 things. But then I love that in the evening, it gives you that opportunity to check back in. And it's a very 5-minute quick experience, but it's incredibly enriching. And so those are the 2 things that I stay consistent with.
Yeah, I think the meditation, I think it's bookending your day is just so important, and I think that the 5-minute journal, I think it's just so clever, and it's so powerful. I think it really is.
Mm-hmm.
Kim, thank you for coming along today. It's been a huge pleasure. Where can people get in touch with you?
Yes, I'm excited to say so a couple of different ways. So from a LinkedIn perspective, if they just search Kim Bohr, Bohr, they'll find me there. I'm on Twitter at Kim Bohr as well. But for your listeners, I provided 3 complimentary offers for them to take advantage of. One's a checklist that they can download, and it's around the 7 reasons most strategic plans fail. So it goes through and it gives some tips around if you're experiencing this, here's something to think about. There's also a very short video with 3 steps on it that they can view that's really around that mindset of change when we're looking at launching any strategic initiatives or working with our teams. Anybody can take advantage of it. And then the 3rd one is if anybody wanted to have a conversation, there's an opportunity to schedule that with me. And then the book is on Amazon as well. So if anybody wants to get a hold of that resource, they can go to my website, and it's the Innovare Group. So THEINNOV as in Victor, aregroup.com/winning. And it's customized for your listeners, and everything there they can get immediate access to without having to leave any information.
Kim, that's extremely generous of you. Thank you for doing that. It's been a huge
Yeah,
pleasure. I'd love to come back and do another one, but thank you so much for being with us today.
thank you. Thank you for having me, John. It's been a really great conversation.